August 6, 1945. 8:15 hours. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, 90 feet underground, the war room of Japan's High Command thrummed with the routine hum of a losing war. Thick concrete walls muffled the distant sounds of a city still pretending victory was possible. Inside, Field Marshal Shinroku Hatahata's morning intelligence briefing unfolded like every other day, a ritual of managed decline. But that morning, at precisely 0815 hours, the rhythm was shattered. Lieutenant Colonel Tisher Yamamoto, communications officer, burst through the steel door, breathless, breaking every code of military decorum. No bow, no formality. In his trembling hands, he held a decoded transmission from Hiroshima. It was short, fragmentary, sent just before all communications ceased. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Blast radius exceeds all previous bombardment. Unknown weapon type. Casualties catastrophic. Request immediate. The message ended mid-sentence. Static. Silence. General Yoshiro Yumizu, chief of the Imperial General Staff, read it 3 times. His first thought was simple disbelief. Perhaps the Americans had launched the largest bombing raid in history. 500 B-29s dropping incendiaries at once. That could explain such devastation. Nothing else made sense. But as more reports filtered in, the impossible began to take shape. Weather reconnaissance confirmed only 3 B-29s had flown over Hiroshima that morning, not 300. At 10 o'clock hours, reconnaissance pilots described something never before seen, a mushroom-shaped cloud, glowing with strange purples and oranges, rising 40,000 feet into the sky and visible from 150 miles away. At 11:30, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first eyewitness report, a railway official who had been 15 miles from the city. He spoke of a flash brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by a wave of pressure that threw trains off their tracks. The entire city center, he said, was gone, replaced by a burning firestorm. By early afternoon, the mood inside the underground headquarters shifted from confusion to dread. Something unimaginable had happened. Something that defied every principle of war the Japanese military understood. The shock in Tokyo. The War Council confronts the impossible. The afternoon of August 6, 1945, descended into a silence so dense it seemed to press against the walls of the Imperial War Council chamber. The men seated around the long polished table beneath the Imperial Palace had spent years orchestrating the war, years believing that spirit could defy steel, that conviction could outweigh machinery. Now, the very foundation of those beliefs trembled. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki entered the chamber carrying the accumulated reports from Hiroshima, dozens of pages of intercepted messages, eyewitness statements, and reconnaissance summaries. His hands shook slightly as he laid the documents on the table. The faces around him, General Korechika Anami, Admiral Somu Toyoda, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, and General Yoshiro Yumizu, were carved in stone. They had endured the humiliation of loss before, but this was different. This was incomprehension. Suzuki's voice cracked the silence. "Gentlemen," he began, "we must consider what this means." General Anami, the Minister of War and the embodiment of Japan's unyielding military pride, spoke first, his tone sharp with defiance. "American propaganda," he said dismissively. "They want us to believe they possess weapons they do not have. Hiroshima was destroyed by conventional bombing, nothing more." His words echoed hollowly through the chamber. "Deception," he continued, "to make us fear what does not exist." But Admiral Toyoda, calm, analytical, and precise, interrupted him, something unthinkable under normal military protocol. 3 aircraft, Anami-san. Not 300. 3. His words cut through the air like the blade of a katana. Our radar tracked them. Our observers saw them. The mathematics of destruction do not lie. A heavy stillness followed. In that instant, every man in the room felt the truth pressing down on them. Something entirely new had entered the war, something that rendered all their strategies meaningless. For 3 years, Japan's military doctrine had rested on a single assumption, that the American war machine, vast as it was, could be outlasted by Japan's willpower and tactical ingenuity. America's factories could build more ships, more tanks, and more planes, but Japanese soldiers would fight with such ferocity that the enemy's political resolve would crumble before victory was within reach. That belief had shaped every decision since Pearl Harbor. When American shipyards turned out cargo vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them, the generals told themselves that production was no substitute for spirit. When B-29 bombers darkened the skies over Tokyo, they believed Japan's divine warriors would endure what others could not. But now the message from Hiroshima suggested something beyond endurance. It suggested that America's true power had only begun to reveal itself. At 1,600 hours, Intelligence Officer Colonel Hideaki Sato presented his assessment to the council. His voice trembled with the gravity of what he was about to say. For years, his team had tracked American industrial data, tonnage, manpower, production rates, and every number had confirmed the same conclusion: Japan was fighting a battle of arithmetic it could never win. America has produced 88,000 tanks during this war, he began, while we have produced barely 6,000. They have built 41 aircraft carriers to our 15. Their shipyards launch cargo vessels faster than we can even train crews. The men around the table stared blankly at the figures. None of it was new, yet somehow, until this moment, none of it had felt real. Then Sato said the words that silenced the room entirely. "If the Americans can destroy entire cities with a single bomb," he whispered, "then we are no longer fighting the same war. Our calculations mean nothing. Our courage means nothing. They have advanced beyond our comprehension." Foreign Minister Togo leaned forward, his face pale, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they have one such bomb," he said slowly, "then we must assume they have more." It was a sentence that marked the psychological breaking point of the Japanese high command. The illusion of equality, the comforting lie that Japan's spiritual superiority could balance America's material dominance, was gone. The men in that bunker were forced to confront what they had denied for years. America had not been fighting at full capacity. The nation they thought soft and indulgent had been waging war with only a fraction of its strength, developing weapons in secret while fighting across 2 oceans. In the following hours, the room filled with an uneasy murmuring as the council tried to reconcile the impossible with the known. Admiral Toyota stood before the massive wall map of the Pacific, pointing to the locations of every known American base. "They built an empire of production," he said. "Their factories are cities. Their universities are laboratories of war." His voice tightened. "They have been preparing for something far beyond our understanding." Togo's secretary entered the chamber carrying a written testimony from a survivor, a man who had seen Hiroshima vanish before his eyes. The statement was read aloud, each word a hammer blow. A blinding flash. A wave of heat. The city center consumed in an instant. Shadows burned into stone. Human beings reduced to outlines on walls. When the reading ended, no one spoke. For the first time, the men who had led Japan into war, men who had dismissed intelligence reports, ignored Yamamoto's warnings, and silenced dissenting voices, faced the truth that had been whispering to them since Midway, since Guadalcanal, since Saipan. Their empire, their faith in the supremacy of will, had been a grand illusion. Prime Minister Suzuki finally broke the silence. "We are fighting an enemy we do not understand," he said quietly. "We have mistaken their restraint for weakness." He looked around the table, at Anami's clenched jaw, at Toyota's haunted eyes, at Togo's trembling hands. "They were not fighting to win quickly," he said. "They were fighting to win completely." Outside, Tokyo continued its daily rhythm. Clerks filing reports, soldiers drilling, citizens scavenging for food, unaware that beneath their feet, the men who commanded the empire were beginning to grasp the full extent of their defeat. In the flickering light of the war room, the myth of Japanese invincibility finally began to die. The men who had built it sat in silence, surrounded by maps that no longer meant anything, staring at the first undeniable proof that the world had entered a new age, a world where courage and sacrifice would no longer be enough to win a war. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan's leaders were afraid, not of death, but of irrelevance. America's hidden power, the collapse of the war illusion. The telegram from Hiroshima still lay on the table, smudged by the sweat of trembling hands, the characters barely legible under the flickering yellow light of the underground bunker. Outside, the war-torn capital of Tokyo baked under the August sun, its streets reduced to rubble, its skies streaked with the black scars of war. But down here, beneath 90 feet of earth and steel, something more devastating than bombs was happening: the slow and irreversible collapse of belief. For years, Japan's military leaders had built an illusion, a wall of unshakable faith in their divine destiny. They had convinced themselves that no matter the odds, the spirit of Japan, the Yamato Damashii, would triumph over Western machinery and logic. They believed in the power of sacrifice, in the glory of the emperor's cause, and in the righteousness of endless struggle. But now, in the silence following Hiroshima, that illusion began to crack. At precisely 8:15 on August 7th, one day after the bombing, a reconnaissance plane from Tokyo reached the ruins of Hiroshima. Its pilot, Captain Tatsuzo Takeda, flew over a vast gray wasteland, a city erased from existence. He described what he saw in his report: no streets, no houses, no shadows. Just a wound upon the earth itself. The pilot's voice broke as he transmitted. Static carried his grief across the airwaves. When the photographs arrived later that morning, they were placed on the conference table before the Supreme War Council. 6 men, the most powerful in the empire, stared at them in silence. No words were spoken for a full minute. Even the hum of the air circulation fans seemed to stop. General Korechika Anami, the war minister, clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. "It cannot be," he whispered. "No weapon can do this." Prime Minister Suzuki's voice trembled. "But it has been done." Then, breaking the silence, Foreign Minister Togo spoke. "Gentlemen, the Americans have created a weapon beyond our understanding. If this is true, then all our resistance, all our sacrifice, means nothing. We are fighting ghosts with swords." In that single moment, the unshakable belief in Japan's invincibility began to wither. The scientists from the Imperial University were summoned. They arrived carrying equations, theories, and rumors, fragments of intelligence intercepted over years. One of them, Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading physicist, stood before the War Council, his voice quiet but certain. "It is possible," he said. "The Americans have achieved atomic fission." The generals looked at each other in confusion. Few of them understood the science. "Explain," demanded General Anami. Dr. Nishina took a deep breath. "It is a bomb built not from fire or explosives, but from the destruction of the atom itself. The energy comes from matter, from the very building blocks of the universe. If they can make one, they can make many." A silence thicker than fear filled the room. For the first time, the myth of the divine wind, the idea that Japan's spirit could repel any invader, felt hollow. At 1400 hours, an emergency meeting of the Imperial General Headquarters began. Every division commander, every branch of the armed forces, listened via secure radio link. The army still believed in resistance. The navy, broken and leaderless, urged surrender. Between them stood the emperor's advisors, desperate to maintain order in the face of disbelief. Field Marshal Shunraku Hata rose to speak. "Gentlemen," he began, "for months we have fought believing that the Americans cannot invade without losing 500,000 men. We were prepared to make them pay that price. But if they possess such a weapon, that calculation no longer matters. They can destroy our cities one by one without ever landing a soldier." The words hung in the air like a sentence of death. Across the table, General Yumizu slammed his fist down. "So what do you propose? That we surrender without honor?" Hata's voice was calm. There is no honor in extinction. But the army could not let go of its faith in the impossible. Even if Hiroshima has fallen, argued Yumizu, we will fight from the mountains, from the forests. The spirit of Japan cannot be destroyed by any machine. Then Togo, weary and gray, answered softly, spirit cannot burn the sky back to blue. Spirit cannot rebuild Hiroshima. We have worshipped war for so long that we cannot see what peace looks like anymore. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Civilians whispered rumors of a sun bomb. Mothers clutched their children as black rain fell over Hiroshima's ashes. Soldiers prayed that their next city would not be next. By nightfall, Emperor Hirohito received the report personally. He read every line twice, his face pale and expressionless. When he spoke, it was barely a whisper. If this weapon exists, our war is already lost. Yet the generals still debated. Some clung to hope that the Americans had only one bomb. Others believed it was a bluff. But deep inside, none could escape the truth. They had been defeated not by an army, but by science, by a civilization that had reached into the heart of nature and turned its secrets into power. In the days that followed, Japan's illusions collapsed piece by piece. The old strategy of endurance, of dying with honor rather than surrendering, began to feel meaningless in a world where one bomb could erase a city. Even the die-hard officers, once proud of their defiance, began to sense that resistance was no longer bravery, it was suicide. America's hidden power had not just destroyed Hiroshima. It had destroyed Japan's faith in its own mythology. And as the War Council adjourned in silence that evening, the generals knew one thing with haunting certainty. The empire had entered a new kind of war, one it could never win. The illusion of control was gone. The future, once bound to the emperor's will, now belonged to the atom. The emperor's dilemma, the road to surrender. August 8, 1945. The air in Tokyo felt heavier than the humid monsoon heat. Even the cicadas outside the imperial palace seemed subdued, their usual shrill song fading into an eerie silence. Inside the maze of concrete corridors beneath the palace, the Supreme War Council, the Big Six, gathered once again. Their faces were drawn, sleepless, haunted by the images of Hiroshima that refused to leave their minds. But this time, the crisis was greater than disbelief. At 2300 hours, as they argued over whether Hiroshima had truly been destroyed by a single bomb or some elaborate trick, a telegram arrived from Moscow. It was short, direct, and devastating. At midnight, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan. For years, Japan's leaders had clung to one final hope, that Stalin might mediate peace with the Allies, that the Soviet Union could serve as a bridge between defeat and survival. Now, that hope had been annihilated in a single stroke. The Red Army had crossed the Manchurian border with tanks, artillery, and nearly 2 million men. The empire was collapsing from both ends, consumed by the atom in the west and crushed by steel in the north. Prime Minister Suzuki read the telegram twice before handing it to War Minister Anami. His voice was barely a whisper. "So, it is over." Anami did not answer. His jaw tightened. For a man whose soul had been forged in the code of Bushido, the warrior's way of death before dishonor, the word over was unbearable. "The Emperor has not spoken," he said. "Until His Majesty commands otherwise, the Empire still fights." But deep down, even Anami knew the truth. By dawn, August 9th, reports flooded Tokyo, Soviet tanks rolling through Manchuria like an unstoppable tide, cities falling in hours, entire divisions surrendering without resistance. And then, as if history itself were conspiring, another blow struck. At 11:02 a.m., the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. The radio crackled with frantic reports. A second city destroyed. Unknown weapon, identical devastation. Silence followed. The War Council sat frozen. There was no longer any illusion left to protect. At 1400 hours, the Emperor summoned his closest advisors. Hirohito, often distant and ceremonial, now appeared as a man burdened by the weight of his nation's soul. He spoke softly, yet every word seemed to echo through the room. The enemy has used a cruel and most terrible weapon. If we continue to fight, it will not only lead to the extinction of our nation, but also to the destruction of all human civilization. The room was still. None dared to speak. Then, Prime Minister Suzuki knelt. "Your Majesty, many of your soldiers wish to die in your name. But if you order surrender, they will obey. They will weep, but they will obey." Hirohito's gaze turned toward the floor. "I do not wish for them to die. I wish for them to live, even in humiliation, if that means Japan will endure." Outside, Tokyo trembled with distant explosions as American bombers continued their raids. The ground itself seemed to pulse with the fading heartbeat of an empire. That night, in the underground shelter, the Supreme War Council met for what would become their most fateful session. The room was thick with cigarette smoke, exhaustion, and quiet rage. Two factions emerged, one demanding surrender under the emperor's condition of preserving the throne, the other vowing to fight to the last man. General Yumisa's voice thundered. "Surrender is not peace. It is death of the soul." Foreign Minister Togo answered calmly, "No, General. Death of the soul is to ignore reality." The argument spiraled, hours passing without resolution. The emperor's representatives watched in despair as their leaders tore each other apart between pride and survival. At 2 o'clock hours, Prime Minister Suzuki made the unthinkable suggestion. Let His Majesty decide. Let the emperor himself choose between war and peace. A stunned silence fell. Never before in Japan's modern history had the emperor been asked to intervene directly in military affairs. He was a divine figure, not a participant in politics, but the embodiment of the nation's spirit. Yet now, the fate of millions depended on his voice. At dawn, Hirohito entered the conference room dressed in white, the color of mourning and purity. Every man in the room knelt low, heads bowed so deeply that their foreheads touched the floor. For several seconds, there was only the sound of their own breathing. Then, the emperor spoke. "I have given deep thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is incalculable. Should we continue to fight, it would result in the total extinction of human civilization." His voice quivered slightly, but his resolve was absolute. To continue this war would mean the ruin of the Japanese people. "I cannot bear to see my innocent subjects suffer any longer. Therefore, I have resolved to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration." There were muffled sobs. Generals wept openly, men who had never cried in their lives. Some whispered prayers. Others bit their tongues until they bled, choosing pain over dishonor. But not everyone accepted peace. That night, a group of fanatic officers conspired to overthrow the government and prevent surrender. They called it Kyujo Incident. Their goal, to seize the imperial palace, destroy the surrender recording, and proclaim a holy war to continue the fight. As Tokyo slept under the threat of coup, loyal guards hid the phonograph recording, the emperor's surrender speech, inside a secret vault beneath the palace. Outside, gunfire echoed briefly through the night as rebels tried and failed to seize the broadcast room. By dawn on August 15th, the rebellion was crushed. The empire was quiet once more. At noon, the emperor's voice, soft, distant, yet unshakably human, drifted through the radios of millions of Japanese homes. "Endure the unendurable. Suffer what must be suffered. Accept the peace." In that moment, a divine figure became mortal, and an empire built on illusion finally faced its truth. The road to surrender was complete, not through conquest, but through conscience. And as the sound of the emperor's voice faded into static, Japan entered a new age, not of victory or defeat, but of awakening. The silence of defeat, the birth of a new Japan. August 15, 1945. The noon sun hung high over Tokyo, pale, still, and mercilessly bright. The once mighty capital lay in ruins, a city of ashes, charred timbers, and shadows that told stories of what used to be. The streets, once alive with the marching feet of soldiers and the distant hum of industry, were now silent. Not the silence of peace, but of surrender, a silence so deep it seemed to press against the soul. Inside every home, shop, and barracks, millions of Japanese gathered around their radios. Men in uniform knelt beside barefoot children. Old women clutched prayer beads. Young boys saluted in trembling confusion. Static hissed for several seconds, and then, for the first time in history, the voice of the divine emperor reached his people. To our good and loyal subjects. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation. The voice was high, distant, almost ghostly, spoken in formal court Japanese few could fully understand. Yet everyone grasped the meaning. The war was over. The empire had surrendered. In cities and villages alike, people fell to their knees, some in relief, others in disbelief. Soldiers wept silently, their tears falling onto the floors of half-burned homes. Mothers cried not for defeat, but for survival. And across the nation, an unthinkable realization took root. The emperor, once believed divine, had chosen to yield to mortal necessity. For the first time in 2,000 years, Japan bowed not in triumph, but in humility. In the following hours, the enormity of defeat began to sink in. Banners of the rising sun were taken down. Generals burned confidential documents. Students who had trained to become suicide pilots stood aimlessly in courtyards, staring at the sky that would no longer need their sacrifice. Tokyo was quiet that night. Not a single air raid siren, not a single bomb. Just wind passing through the ruins, and the faint echo of a voice that had ended an age. At the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito sat alone in his private chamber. His attendants had withdrawn, leaving him in the stillness of his decision. Before him lay two objects, the imperial seal and a small crystal radio. The seal symbolized power, the radio carried his surrender. Between them stretched the invisible weight of history. He had saved his people, yet in doing so, had broken the myth that sustained their world. To the men of his generation, surrender was worse than death. But Hirohito, looking out over the dark city, understood something deeper. That survival was not cowardice if it preserved the chance to rebuild, to begin again. He whispered softly to himself, "This is not the end of Japan. It is the end of the Japan we were." The following weeks were a blur of uncertainty. American planes, once harbingers of death, now dropped food and medicine. The streets that had echoed with marching boots filled with silence and hunger. Millions of soldiers began their long journeys home, their heads bowed, their futures unknown. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the ruins still smoked. Doctors walked barefoot through the rubble, treating survivors whose skin burned from radiation they did not understand. Children played among the ruins, too young to grasp that the dust beneath their feet had once been their city. Japan had entered a twilight, a liminal space between death and rebirth. When General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo Bay aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, the symbolism was unmistakable. The proud empire of the rising sun, which had once sought to dominate Asia, now stood in the shadow of its conquerors. On the deck of the battleship, beneath a gray morning sky, representatives of the Japanese government signed the instrument of surrender. Their pens shook as they wrote. Across from them stood the Allied commanders, stern, silent, and victorious. Cameras clicked. History turned a page. At that exact moment, a Japanese naval officer standing at the pier whispered, "So this is how an empire dies, not with a roar but with a signature." But even in that moment of humiliation, seeds of renewal were being sown. Beneath the rubble of Tokyo, a new generation began to dream, not of conquest, but of creation. Factories once used for weapons began producing tools, bicycles, and radios. Farmers returned to the fields. Children went back to school. And the people, stripped of pride but not of purpose, began to rediscover what it meant to live, not to die for their country. The American occupation that followed was strict, yet transformative. Japan's ancient hierarchies were dismantled. A new constitution was drafted, one that replaced the sword with the pen, and the divine emperor with a symbolic one. Women were given rights. Democracy, once a foreign idea, began to take root. Still, the memory of war lingered like a scar across the nation's heart. Hiroshima became a pilgrimage site, not of vengeance, but of remembrance. Every August, as the cicadas returned and the skies turned the color of fire, bells rang across the Peace Park. Survivors stood in silence, their eyes reflecting both pain and forgiveness. In the ruins of defeat, Japan discovered its greatest strength, the ability to rebuild. Within a single generation, the land of ashes became a land of innovation. The same spirit that had once fueled its armies now powered its industries, its artists, its thinkers. The silence of defeat gave birth to a new kind of victory, not won by domination, but by resilience. And so, as night fell over Tokyo in late 1945, a fragile peace settled over the islands. The winds that once carried warplanes now rustled through fields of new rice. The emperor, once worshipped as divine, now walked among mortals as a symbol of endurance. Japan had lost its empire, but found its humanity. The silence that followed was not the stillness of despair, but the first breath of rebirth. The shadow of the atom, reflections of a new world. The war had ended, but the world had not yet found peace. It stood at the edge of something new, a silence not of triumph but of terror. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, humanity began to awaken to the shadow it had cast upon itself. The atom had been split, and from its wound poured both light and fear. In the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the dawn broke differently. The mornings were pale and colorless. The sunlight filtered through a haze of dust and radiation. The cities that once hummed with life now lay like open graves, where twisted steel and shattered tiles marked the outlines of vanished streets. Amid the rubble, survivors wandered, their skin burned, their eyes hollow, their spirits suspended between life and death. They called it Pikadon, the flash and the boom. Words simple enough for a child to understand, yet heavy enough to bear the weight of apocalypse. American scientists arrived first, notebooks in hand, their expressions solemn. They measured radiation, catalogued destruction, and photographed the aftermath. They came to understand what they had done, not as warriors, but as witnesses. The data they gathered would shape science for generations, but no formula could capture the silence that hung over the dead. The world looked on in awe and horror. Newspapers called the bomb a miracle of science, a weapon to end all wars. But in the quiet hearts of men, a new fear took root, that in mastering nature, humanity had finally discovered how to destroy itself. In Washington, President Truman spoke of victory and divine providence. In Moscow, Stalin demanded his own bomb, his own piece of the atom's secret. And so, even as the ashes of Hiroshima still smoldered, a new war began, one without battlefields, but far more dangerous. The world had entered the atomic age. For Japan, the shadow of the atom was not a matter of politics, it was survival. Doctors and monks walked side by side through the ruins, tending to the dying with hands blistered by radiation. Mothers searched for children who no longer had names. Priests prayed over ashes that once had faces. Every night, the city glowed faintly, not from fire, but from memory. In the years that followed, the survivors, hibakusha, they called themselves, became living reminders of the bomb's cost. Their bodies bore its scars, their voices carried its warning. And from their suffering, a new philosophy began to take root in Japan, a rejection of war, not from weakness, but from understanding. Schools rebuilt their walls with paper cranes, symbols of peace made by children who refused to forget. Scientists turned their talents from weapons to energy, seeking to harness the atom's light without its darkness. Artists painted shadows on white walls, reminders of those vaporized in an instant. Writers filled pages with questions that had no answers. Can progress exist without mercy? Can knowledge be innocent? The emperor, once silent behind divine authority, now spoke to his people as a man among them. He visited the ruins of Hiroshima, his face pale and solemn. Standing amid the silence, he whispered only one word: never again. Beyond Japan, the shadows spread across the globe. The United States and the Soviet Union raced to build arsenals of unimaginable power. The deserts of Nevada, the steppes of Kazakhstan, the islands of the Pacific, all became testing grounds for the new gods of destruction. The sky itself became a witness, lit again and again by man-made suns. And yet, amid this darkness, a strange kind of hope emerged. The world, for the first time in history, was united by fear, the fear of total annihilation. Diplomats spoke of peace not as an ideal, but as necessity. Scientists, haunted by what they had unleashed, began to warn against the weapons they once built. Albert Einstein, who had once urged Roosevelt to pursue the atomic project, now wrote, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, except our way of thinking." His words echoed across continents, a reminder that technology had outpaced morality. The United Nations was born in that uneasy atmosphere, a fragile attempt to replace the law of war with the law of conscience. And in that fragile peace, Japan began to rebuild, rising from the ashes not with defiance, but with resolve. By the 1950s, Hiroshima was alive again, a city of memory and renewal. Its skyline filled once more with buildings and laughter, but at its heart stood the Genbaku Dome, the skeletal remains of the old exhibition hall that had survived the blast. It stood untouched, a scar made sacred, a monument to what humanity must never repeat. Every August, as the cicadas sang their mournful song, thousands gathered at the Peace Memorial Park. They released paper lanterns down the Motoyasu River, their flickering lights drifting toward the sea, each flame a soul, each glow a promise. The water carried them away gently, like prayers whispered to the wind. Around the world, Japan's silence became its voice. It spoke not with armies, but with art, with science, with the quiet dignity of a nation that had seen the end of the world and chosen to build again. Its cities glowed not from fire, but from neon. Its factories produced not weapons, but technology that connected humanity instead of dividing it. The same country that had once plunged Asia into darkness now became a symbol of rebirth, proof that even from the heart of destruction, life could begin again. The shadow of the atom never fully disappeared. It lingers in every laboratory, every missile silo, every debate about power and progress. Yet perhaps hidden within that shadow lies the faint outline of wisdom, the understanding that true strength is not found in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to protect. Hiroshima was both an ending and a beginning, the moment humanity looked into the mirror and saw both its brilliance and its madness. In the ruins of one city, the whole world caught a glimpse of its own reflection, and from that reflection, the dream of peace was reborn. And so the shadow of the atom remains, stretching across time, silent yet eternal, a reminder that the greatest weapon ever created was not the bomb itself, but the knowledge that came with it. That mankind's survival depends not on its power, but on its mercy. The legacy of fire, how Hiroshima changed humanity forever. The world after Hiroshima was not merely different, it was reborn, though not in triumph. It was a rebirth through ash, through reflection, through the unbearable question that still haunts humanity: what have we done? When the mushroom cloud rose above Hiroshima, it was more than the annihilation of a city. It was the detonation of human innocence. For millennia, war had been bound by steel, by courage, by the limits of flesh. But now, man had forged a weapon that dissolved the boundary between soldier and child, between battlefield and home. Hiroshima was not just destroyed, it was erased. And in that erasure, humanity glimpsed the terrible shadow of its own potential. In the weeks that followed, news of the bomb rippled through the world like a whispered curse. For the victors, it was the end of a nightmare. For the vanquished, it was the end of a world. Yet as photographs of the flattened city spread across newspapers, something shifted. The very people who had cheered victory felt a new kind of fear, not of enemies, but of themselves. It was as if the planet had looked in the mirror and seen for the first time the monster that reason could create. The survivors of Hiroshima, the hibakusha, carried that reflection in their bodies. Skin melted into cloth, shadows seared onto walls, hearts beating inside ruined chests. They became the living proof of the cost of knowledge untempered by compassion. Their stories, once silenced by shame and censorship, would later echo across decades, voices trembling not with vengeance, but with warning. They spoke not to accuse, but to awaken. In Japan, the ashes of Hiroshima became the soil of renewal. Out of the rubble rose not revenge, but resolve. The Japanese people, broken, disoriented, stripped of empire and pride, began to rebuild a nation rooted not in conquest, but in conscience. Schools taught not the glory of war, but the sanctity of peace. Temples rang bells for the dead not to summon gods, but to remind the living. The city that once vanished under blinding light became the world's loudest voice against the darkness of nuclear arms. The world listened, some more closely than others. In the United States, scientists who had built the bomb wrestled with guilt. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, stood before the ashes of his achievement and whispered words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Those words did not echo in triumph, they echoed in despair. The men who had turned atoms into weapons realized too late that science without soul is destruction without end. Governments, however, learned a different lesson. In Washington and Moscow, Hiroshima became not a warning, but a blueprint. Within years, the arms race began, a grotesque mirror of fear where power was measured not in peace, but in megatons. The mushroom cloud that had once silenced Japan now hovered over every nation. It was no longer about who would win a war, but who would survive one. Humanity entered an age of paranoia where safety depended on mutual annihilation. And yet, even in that fear, Hiroshima persisted as conscience. Artists painted it, poets wept it, philosophers debated it, and leaders invoked it. From the rubble of one city, an entire generation of pacifists, thinkers, and dreamers arose. The question was no longer how to destroy faster, but how to remember deeper. In Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park, the atomic dome still stands, skeletal and silent, against a sky that once burned white. Every August 6th, people from around the world gather beneath that same sky, not to mourn a nation, but to honor a lesson. As the peace bell tolls, the river of lanterns drifts past, each light a promise that memory will outlast fire. Children of those who once fought now release the lanterns together, Japanese and American, praying for a world where science redeems instead of ruins. Through Hiroshima, art itself transformed. The Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi, beauty in impermanence, found new meaning amid ruins. Literature, from Kenzaburo Oi's Hiroshima notes to Sadako's paper cranes, turned tragedy into testimony. The small hand-folded cranes became symbols of fragile hope, proof that even after the sky falls, humanity can still create and forgive. But Hiroshima's legacy is not confined to Japan. It lives in every debate about nuclear weapons, in every protest against war, in every treaty that tries to cage the atom's fury. It shaped international law, inspired the United Nations' very charter, and gave rise to movements that see peace not as a dream, but as the only logical evolution of civilization. And still the fire burns, not in vengeance, but in vigilance. Hiroshima reminds us that technology races ahead of morality, and that every generation must decide anew whether it will be the builder or the destroyer. The bomb was not just an American invention or a Japanese tragedy, it was a human act. And therefore, its lesson belongs to all of us. As the last survivors grow old, their stories become sacred, the living memory of the day humanity stepped beyond war and into self-awareness. They are not victims of history, they are its teachers. Through them, we learn that peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of understanding. Hiroshima changed humanity forever, not because it ended a war, but because it revealed the soul's final frontier, compassion. It proved that the greatest power we possess is not the atom, but empathy. And so, every generation must return to that quiet city by the river, not to grieve, but to remember. For as long as Hiroshima stands, the world will know there are no true victors in a war of fire, only survivors who chose to heal. The sky that once burned now glows with paper lanterns. The wind that once carried ash now carries prayers. And in that silence, beneath the shadow of the atom dome, humanity whispers to itself, never again.